Hi, third grade. I have your old Celebrate book out, the hardcover reading book, and I'm going in just a little bit to page 62. And I thought it would be fun to read Henry and Beezus, this Beverly Cleary story. This episode is called Ribsy and the Roast. It's a cute story, so I thought you would enjoy it, and I will share it with you. Follow along. Henry Huggins stood by the front window of his square white house on Klickitat Street and wondered why Sunday afternoon seemed so much longer than any other part of the week. Mrs. Huggins was reading a magazine, and Mr. Huggins was reading the funnies in the Sunday Journal. Henry's dog Ribsy was asleep in the middle of the living room rug. As Henry looked at him, he suddenly sat up, scratched hard behind his left ear with his left hind foot, and flopped down again without even bothering to open his eyes. Henry pressed his nose against the window pane and looked out at Klickitat Street. The only person he saw was Scooter McCarthy, who was riding up and down the sidewalk on his bicycle. "I sure wish I had a bike," remarked Henry to his mother and father as he watched Scooter. "I wish you did too," agreed his mother, "but with prices and taxes going up all the time, I'm afraid we can't get you one this year." "Maybe things will be better next year," said Mr. Huggins, dropping the funnies and picking up the sports section. Henry sighed. He wanted a bicycle now. He could see himself riding up and down Klickitat Street on a shiny red bike. He could wear his genuine Daniel Boone coonskin cap with the snap-on tail. Only he wouldn't wear the tail fastened to the hat. He would tie it to the handlebars so that it would wave in the breeze as he whizzed along. "Henry," said Mrs. Huggins, interrupting his thoughts, "please don't rub your nose against my clean window." "All right, Mom," said Henry. "I sure wish something would happen around here sometime." "Why don't you go over to Robert's house? Maybe he can think of something to do," suggested Mrs. Huggins as she turned a page of her magazine. "Okay," agreed Henry. Robert's mother said they couldn't give the white mice rides on Robert's electric train anymore, but maybe they could think of something else. "Come on, Ribsy," said Henry. Ribsy stood up and shook himself, scattering hair over the rugs. We'll just take a look at the illustration here. Good old Ribsy taking his doggy nap, just like Chelsea's taking her doggy nap. "That dog," sighed Mrs. Huggins. Henry thought he had better leave quickly. As he and Ribsy started down the front steps, Robert came around the corner. "What's up, Doc?" said Robert. "Hi," responded Henry. "My dad said maybe if I came over to your house, you could think of something to do," said Robert. The boys sat down on the front steps. "Here comes old Scooter," observed Robert. The two boys watched the older boy pumping down the street on his bicycle. He was whistling, and not only was he riding without touching the handlebars, he even had his hands in his pockets. "Hi," said Scooter casually without stopping. "Big show-off," muttered Robert. "I bet he takes that bike to bed with him." "He sure thinks he's smart," agreed Henry. "He's been riding up and down all afternoon. Come on, let's go around in the backyard where we won't have to watch old Scooter show off all day. Maybe we can find something to do back there." Ribsy followed at the boys' heels. Unfortunately, the backyard was no more interesting than the front. The only sign of life was next door. A large yellow cat was dozing on the Grumby's back steps, and there was smoke coming from the barbecue pit. Robert looked thoughtful. "Does Ribsy ever chase cats?" "Not that old Fluffy." Henry, understanding what was on Robert's mind, explained that Mrs. Grumby sprinkled something called Doggy Be Gone. Take a look at the picture here. Doggy Be Gone on her side of the rose bushes. Ribsy disliked the smell of it and was careful to stay on his side of the bushes. Robert was disappointed. "I thought Ribsy might—" "No such luck," interrupted Henry, looking at his dog, who had settled himself by the back steps to continue his nap. Henry picked a blade of grass and started to blow through it when the squeak slam of the Grumby screen door made him look up. "Jeepers," he whispered. Stepping carefully over Fluffy, Mr. Hector Grumby walked down the back steps. He was wearing a chef's tall hat, a tall white hat, and an immense white apron. "What's cooking?" was written across the hat, and on the apron was printed a recipe for Bar X Ranch barbecue sauce. Mr. Grumby carried a tray full of bowls, jars, bottles, and what appeared to be bunches of dried weeds. "Is he really going to cook?" whispered Robert. "Search me," answered Henry. The two boys edged closer to the rose bushes that divided the 2 yards. "Hello, Mr. Grumby," said Henry. "Hello there, Henry." Mr. Grumby crossed the lawn and set the tray on the edge of the barbecue pit in the corner of his yard. He peeled a small object which he put into a bowl, sprinkled with salt, and mashed with a little wooden stick. Then he broke off pieces of the dried weeds and mashed them too. Henry and Robert exchanged puzzled looks. "Need any help, Mr. Grumby?" asked Henry. "No, thank you." Mr. Grumby poured a few drops of something into the mixture. "Is that something that's supposed to be good to eat?" asked Robert. Mr. Grumby didn't answer. "What's that stuff in the bowl?" asked Henry. "Herbs and garlic," answered Mr. Grumby. "Now run along and play, boys. I'm busy." Henry and Robert did not move. "Etta!" called Mr. Grumby to his wife. "I forgot the vinegar." He coughed as a breeze blew smoke in his face. "I'll go get it for you," offered Henry, but his neighbor ignored him. Squeak, slam went the screen. Mrs. Grumby stepped over Fluffy and walked across the yard with a bottle in her hand. "Hector, can't we take your friends out to dinner instead of going to all this trouble?" she asked as she fanned smoke out of her eyes. "This is no trouble at all." Mr. Grumby added a few drops of vinegar to the mixture in the bowl. Henry thought Mrs. Grumby looked cross as she said, "Hector, why don't you let me cook the meat in the house? It would be so much easier, and then we could bring it outside to eat." "Now, Etta, I know what I'm doing." Mr. Grumby poured a few drops from another bottle and mashed some more. "But I don't like to see you spoil the flavor of a perfectly good piece of meat with all that seasoning." He doesn't look too pleased, does he? "It would be different if you really knew how to cook." Mrs. Grumby frowned as she swatted at a bug circling over the sauce. Mr. Grumby frowned even more. "Anyone who can read a recipe can cook." Mrs. Grumby's face turned red as she clapped the bug between her hands and said sharply, "Oh, is that so? What about the time you cut up tulip bulbs in the hamburgers because you thought they were onions?" "That," said Mr. Grumby, even more sharply, "was different." Mrs. Grumby angrily fanned smoke with her apron. "Just remember when we try to eat this mess you're fixing that it wasn't my idea. Even if the recipe is any good, the meat will probably be burned on the outside and raw inside. Smoke will get in our eyes and we'll be eaten alive by mosquitoes and—" Mr. Grumby interrupted. "Etta, we won't argue about it any more. I invited my friends to a barbecue, and we're going to have a barbecue." Henry and Robert were disappointed. They hoped the Grumbys would argue about it a lot more. Then Mr. Grumby looked at the recipe printed on his apron. Because he was looking down at it, the words were upside down for him. "What does it say here?" he asked, pointing to his stomach. Henry and Robert could not help snickering. "Now, boys, run along and don't bother us. We're busy," said Mrs. Grumby. "Come on, Robert." Henry turned away from the rose bushes. He felt uncomfortable around Mrs. Grumby because he thought she didn't like him. At least she didn't like Ribsy, and that was the same as not liking Henry. He didn't want to make her any crosser than she was already, although secretly he couldn't see why she minded Ribsy's burying a bone in her pansy bed once in a while. Henry tried standing on his hands just to show Mrs. Grumby he wasn't paying any attention to what she was doing. Then he heard someone coming up his driveway. It was his friend Beezus and her little sister Ramona, who lived in the next block on Klickitat Street. Beezus' real name was Beatrice, but Ramona called her Beezus, and so did everyone else. Beezus was carrying a baton, and Ramona was riding a shiny new tricycle. "Whoa!" yelled Ramona to her tricycle. Then she got off and tied it to a bush with a jumping rope. "Hello," said Beezus. "See my baton?" The boys examined the metal rod, which was about 2.5 feet long, with a rubber knob at each end. "What are you going to do with it?" asked Henry. "Twirl it," said Beezus. "I'll bet," scoffed Robert. "I am too," said Beezus. "I take lessons every Saturday. By June I'll be good enough so I can twirl it in the Junior Rose Festival Parade, and someday I'm going to be a drum majorette." "June is only a couple of months away," said Henry, wondering what he would do in the parade this year. "Let's see you twirl it." Beezus held the baton over her head and started to turn it with her right hand. It slipped from her fingers and hit her on the head. "Boing!" shouted the two boys together. "You keep quiet," said Beezus crossly. "Let me try," said Henry. "No," said Beezus, whose feelings were hurt. "I didn't want to anyway." Henry started across the yard. "Come on, Robert, let's climb the cherry tree." "All right for you, Henry Huggins," shouted Beezus as the boys scrambled up through the branches. "I'm going home. Come on, Ramona, untie your horse." But Ramona had seen Ribsy, and she began to pat him on the head. Ribsy groaned in his sleep and sat up to scratch. Suddenly, he was wide awake, sniffing the air. "Woof!" said Ribsy. Did that wake you up, Chels? Did that wake you up? She's listening. Henry could tell by the sound of the bark that Ribsy was excited about something. He peered out through the leaves of the cherry tree, but could see nothing unusual in his backyard. He saw Ribsy stand up, shake himself, and trot purposefully toward the Grumbies' backyard, with Ramona running after him. Henry looked across the rose bushes and groaned at what he saw. On a platter beside the barbecue pit was a large, raw piece of raw meat. Excuse me, I saw raw, said raw twice. The Grumbies were nowhere in sight. "Here, Ribsy, come here, boy," called Henry frantically, but Ribsy did not stop. "Catch him, Beezus!" Ramona, who was trying to follow Ribsy through the rose bushes, shrieked. "Hold still," directed Beezus, struggling with her little sister. "I can't get you loose from all these thorns when you wiggle that way." "Come on, we better be getting out of here." Henry slipped and slid down the tree. "I bet the rain washed off the doggy be gone." Uh-oh. That does not look so good. "I guess we better," agreed Robert cheerfully. After all, Ribsy wasn't his dog. Henry hit the ground and tried to run through the rose bushes. Thorns clawed at his jeans and held him fast. "Here, Ribsy," he yelled. "Here, Ribs, old boy." Ribsy jumped for the roast. With one desperate jerk, Henry tried to free himself from the roses. The thorns dug deeper into his legs. Ribsy sank his teeth into the meat and pulled it to the ground. Mr. Grumby came through the back door with an armload of kindling. "Hey, stop that dog!" he yelled, dropping the wood on his toe. "Ow!" he groaned as he started toward Ribsy and stepped on Fluffy's tail. An ear-splitting yowl brought Mrs. Grumby to the back porch. "Fluffy," she cooed, "did the man step on the precious pussycat's tail?" Ribsy paused to take a firmer grip on the roast. "If that cat hasn't any more sense than to sleep on the step," snapped Mr. Grumby. "Hey, make that dog come back here." "Oh, my goodness," exclaimed Mrs. Grumby when she saw what had happened. "Here, Ribsy! Here, Ribsy!" That was just what Ribsy needed to make him start running. He didn't like Mrs. Grumby. He knew she sprinkled Doggy Be Gone on the shrubbery to keep him away. With one final yank and the sound of ripping cloth, Henry jerked away from the bushes. "Tackle him!" yelled Robert, who was still trying to untangle himself from the thorns. Henry flung himself at his dog, but Ribsy raced on. Henry picked himself up off the Grumbies' driveway and ran after him. Around the Grumbies' house he ran and on down Click-a-Tat Street. He could hear Robert's and Mr. Grumpy's feet pounding down the sidewalk after him. "Ribsy!" yelled Henry. "Hey, come back here!" shouted Robert. "Stop, thief!" bellowed Mr. Grumpy, holding on to his tall white hat with one hand. Doors and windows began to open. "What's cooking, Grumpy?" someone called out. Henry heard his mother say, "Oh, that dog!" "Henry!" shouted Mr. Huggins. "Go get him, Grumpy!" yelled the man across the street. Mr. Grumpy paused for breath. "Somebody head him off," he directed. Ribsy ran into the street. A car turned the corner. "Ribsy!" wailed Henry, afraid to look. "Hey, look out!" warned Robert. The car slammed on its brakes. Ribsy ran back to the sidewalk. If only Henry could put on a burst of speed and make a really good flying tackle. But no matter how fast he ran, Ribsy was just out of his reach. He glanced over his shoulder and saw that Mr. Grumpy's face was red and he had lost his hat. "Come here, sir," panted Mr. Grumpy. He wasn't used to running. Then his footsteps grew slower and slower until they stopped altogether. Henry ran on, with Robert close behind. Their friend Mary Jane came out of her house and started down the sidewalk toward them. If only she would stop Ribsy. "Catch him!" yelled Henry. When Ribsy was only a few feet from Mary Jane, he dropped the meat on the sidewalk. Here was her chance. "Get it, Mary Jane!" Henry shouted with almost all the breath he had left. "Get the meat!" Mary Jane stood staring at Ribsy. "Pick up the meat, you dope!" yelled Robert. Still, Mary Jane did not move. Ribsy waited until Henry was almost within tackling distance before taking a firm grip on the roast and starting to run again. "Mary Jane!" panted Henry. "Head him off!" Mary Jane stepped aside and Ribsy ran on. Henry felt as if he could not move another step. "Why didn't you grab the meat?" he demanded as he paused to catch his breath. "You could have caught him if you wanted to," accused Robert. "I couldn't either, stop your dirty old dog," said Mary Jane. "Can't you see I'm wearing my Sunday school dress?" "Mary Jane, you give me a pain." Henry glared at her. "You're a poet and don't know it," said Mary Jane, twirling around to show off her full skirt. Robert and Henry looked at each other. "Girls!" Robert clutched Henry's arm and pointed in the direction from which Ribsy had come. "Look!" A police dog, a fox terrier, and a sort of collie were running down Klickitat Street toward Ribsy. Now there would be a dog fight, and the roast would be torn to pieces, and the two big dogs would chew up Ribsy. They would probably chew the fox terrier too, and Henry knew the lady who owned him was very particular about keeping him out of dog fights. Henry would be blamed because the big dogs bit the little dog, and suddenly Henry found he was too tired to do much of anything. He picked up a clod of dirt and threw it at the dogs as they passed him. "Beat it," he said, but he didn't bother to shout. He knew it was no use. Boy, a dog fight! Robert was delighted. "This is going to be keen." "Ah, keep quiet," said Henry. Robert wouldn't feel that way if Ribsy were his dog. The sort of collie was gaining on Ribsy, and the police dog was not far behind. Poor Ribsy! Henry shut his eyes. He couldn't stand seeing Ribsy chewed to pieces. "Gangway, everybody!" It was Scooter's voice. Leaning over his handlebars and pumping as hard as he could, he tore down the street behind the three dogs. He passed Henry and Robert and, swerving to avoid the dogs, caught up with Ribsy. He didn't stop for the curb, but rode right over it with a tremendous bump. Then he flung himself off the bicycle and on top of Ribsy before the dog knew what was happening. Ribsy dropped the meat and Scooter snatched it. He sprang on his bicycle, wheeled around in the middle of the street, and started back toward the Grumpy's house, holding the meat above his head with one hand. The three other dogs and Ribsy all chased after Scooter, barking and growling as they jumped up and tried to snap at the meat. Eluding them all, Scooter pedaled triumphantly back down Klickitat Street, "Hi," he said briefly to Henry and Robert as he passed them. "Hey, give me that meat," demanded Henry. Scooter ignored him. "How do you like that?" said Robert. "He sure thinks he's smart." Henry ran after Scooter, who pedaled even faster. Henry put on a burst of speed. So did Scooter. So did the dogs. Henry could hear the neighbors laughing. He tried to run faster, but Scooter stayed just out of his reach. When Scooter reached the Grumby's house, he handed the meat to its owner. "There you are, Mr. Grumby," he said. Mr. Grumby took the battered roast. "Thank you, Scooter. That was mighty quick thinking on your part." "It wasn't anything," said Scooter modestly. "It was easy to catch up with him on my bike." The other dogs lost interest and ran away, but Ribsy continued to whimper and jump for the meat. Then he gave up and sat panting with his long pink tongue hanging out. Poor Ribsy, thought Henry. He wanted that meat so much. Maybe he's tired of horse meat. Henry wished he'd dared to pet his dog, even though he had been cross with him. "He's a dumb dog," said Scooter. "It's a good thing I came along and saved him from those other dogs when I did." "I think you're mean, Scooter McCarthy," said Beezus. "Poor Ribsy." "Why don't you go home?" said Henry to Scooter. "Now, children," said Mrs. Huggins. Then she said to Mrs. Grumby, "You must let us buy you another roast. Henry can help pay for it out of his allowance. He knows he is supposed to keep his dog out of your yard." "Gee, my mother says roasts are expensive," said Scooter. "You keep quiet." Henry scowled at Scooter. Why was Scooter always around when things happened to him? "Jeepers, I'm sorry, Mrs. Grumby," said Henry. "I don't know what got into Ribsy. He was just hungry, I guess." "He always is," observed Mr. Huggins. Meat markets were closed on Sunday, but Henry knew that the delicatessen counter in the supermarket was open. "Delicatessens have weenies, don't they?" he asked. "I could run down to the supermarket and get some for you if you'd like." "I could go faster on my bike," said Scooter. Mrs. Grumby smiled. "Thank you, Henry. That won't be necessary. I think we'll go out to dinner." She looked at Mr. Grumby, who had started toward the house with the roast. "Just between you and me," she whispered, "I don't think the meat would have been fit to eat with that sauce Mr. Grumby was going to put on it." Then she called to her husband, "Hector, what are you going to do with that dirty piece of meat?" "I suppose he might as well have it," said Mr. Grumby reluctantly. "Not that he deserves it." He threw the remains to Ribsy. Mrs. Grumby paused in the doorway. "Henry, I'm going to bake cookies tomorrow. If you'll stop by on your way home from school, I'll give you some." "Thank you, Mrs. Grumby," answered Henry. She seemed almost glad Ribsy had stolen the roast. At least she wasn't cross anymore. "Here, Ribsy, it isn't time for you to eat yet." Henry tugged at the roast, but Ribsy hung on and growled. "Come on, Dad, give me a hand." Mr. Huggins took hold of the meat, and together they got it away from Ribsy. "I'll put it in the refrigerator for him," said Mr. Huggins, "and I'll have a talk with you later." "Aw, gee, Dad," protested Henry. "I wasn't doing anything." "You wanted something to happen, didn't you?" said Mr. Huggins as he carried the meat into the house. Henry did not answer. He just sighed and sat down on the steps. Why did these things always have to happen to him, anyway?